Hello, welcome to another edition of Capital City Matters. This is a little bit of a change. When I was mayor of Jefferson City, we enjoyed doing programs one a month to cover things going on in the community. And we covered a lot of different issues. And now that I'm no longer mayor, retired from politics, we were talking with the folks here at JCTV about maybe working on a little different format. And the format relates to our role in Jefferson City as the capital city, as the seat of government. And there are just a lot of things going on in and around Jefferson City, things that as residents we kind of drive by the Capitol or we might catch a news story once in a while. But there's a tremendous amount of stuff going on because we are the capital city. And so we changed up the format a little bit, and in the next few months we'll be talking to state leaders about some of the very critical things that are going on in and around state government. And our inaugural guest today, Senator Brad Lager, was kind enough to accept our invitation to not be the first guest of the program, but really be the first guest of the new generation of the program. Senator, thanks.
Hey, thanks for having me here. It's great to be here with you.
And I know that you just came from the Capitol, and you were kind enough, I think, to move your schedule around in terms of introducing some bills to come over here and promptly, and we really appreciate it.
Well, you know, as you said, there are a lot of decisions that are made in any given year in that building that that don't only impact the state as a whole, but really drive, this region and to be very candid, really set the climate by which our state operates under.
And I think a lot of people really throughout the nation look to Missouri to some extent because we have cities, we have rural areas. We're kind of a composite of a lot of things going on in the nation. So I think people really do look to Missouri. Now the folks in Kansas we have to kind of put aside a little bit, but no, people really do look to our state leaders in Missouri. I think for ideas and successes.
Yeah, we've been very blessed as a state. I mean, one, we're a very diverse state from the economic drivers, but number two, for the most part, we are a state that historically has mirrored the country, where the politics were going, as well as really as public policy starts to evolve. And at the end of the day, we're still a state that's pretty culturally conservative, and most importantly, fiscally conservative.
You're from a part of the state, and we were talking before we went on camera, the northwest part of the state. My dad went to a seminary that not very many people know about in Conception, Missouri. He used to tell us stories about the monks, and it was an agricultural environment. And my dad grew up on a dairy farm, and I ended up growing up on a dairy farm too. So my dad always had the greatest respect for both the monks at Conception Abbey in Maryville, or close to Maryville, and also the nuns at Clyde.
Convent in Clyde, yeah.
Had a dairy farm. That was a different generation.
It's interesting you bring both of those up. My mother grew up about a mile from Conception Abbey, and throughout my entire life, we have consistently attended church there. My wife and I still go there. Not every weekend, but we probably go to the Abbey, every couple months. We're still very involved in that community. I have a couple uncles that actually do maintenance at the convent in Clyde. They are both still there. They're very prosperous and continue to do well.
Beautiful country, great farming, agricultural base up there.
It really is.
And you started your political career the same way I started my very limited political career, and that's on the city council, right?
It is. I actually in 2001 ran for the city council in Maryville, and I'm just a small business owner that truly believes that if you want better government, that citizens have to go get involved. And I think that one of the most dangerous dynamics that we have going on in our country right now is when you have career politicians that don't ever go home and run their businesses or live like you and I do, that get up with the same concerns that we have in our business and our companies. They fundamentally govern differently. And that's why I actually think that many of the things that we do in our state in terms of the way that we have a citizen legislature, it's not a full-time job, but you still have those responsibilities at home. I actually believe we get better government because of that.
I really enjoyed being on the city council and being mayor because of that. I really felt like, when you're walking downtown and there's an issue or something, people know you, people you really are in touch with what's going on. So a lot of governmental decisions, obviously the federal government has grown, and we could devote a couple of shows to that. But the whole concept philosophically of where should decisions about tax dollars be made, really it's at that local government level where there's so much accountability.
The closer you can get the decision-making process to the actual taxpayer, to the actual citizens, the better off you'll be every time.
I want to talk about a couple of things going on at the General Assembly. I know it's no fun not having any money to spend, so a lot of the issues really revolve around where not to spend money and where to try to manage that budget, and it's a tough time being in the General Assembly. You've got a couple of bills going that we've had some exposure in the media, and we might just want to take a minute and talk about each of those. Senate Bill 592 talks about human rights and employment discrimination. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about what's going on there?
Sure, absolutely. Senate Bill 592 is actually legislation that I've filed for the last several years. And essentially what has happened is since 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, as the president signed it, Martin Luther King stood on the stage. And that really laid the groundwork for what the discrimination law was going to be in our country. And our state has always mirrored that, meaning our state courts have mirrored the practice of the federal courts. And even after 1991, when that act was actually updated, and ironically, the updates that came in 1991, Senator Danforth was the U.S. senator that carried those. Once again, our state always mirrored it up until the mid-2000s. And what happened in the mid-2000s is through a series of appellate court decisions and Supreme Court decisions, there's been a slow and gradual but methodical move away from the federal practice. And essentially what has happened is these cases, these court cases, have rewritten the discrimination law and employment law in our state to the point where if you're an employer, Missouri is now the worst state in the nation to be sued. Now, if you stop and think about that, I fundamentally believe two things. Number one, I believe that regardless of whether you're an employee or an employer, you should have the same rights and the same protections, whether you're in federal court or you're in state court. That's why our state always mirrored that of the federal government, so it would always be the same. Number two is ultimately, when we're talking about economic growth, we're talking about changing the economic direction that we've been headed, and actually beginning to breathe some life back into this economy. Every elected official wants to talk about how government's going to create jobs. Well, shockingly enough, I'm a guy who believes government doesn't create jobs. But what I will tell you is this: government creates a climate, and that climate either allows the private sector to prosper and grow, or it does not. And there are three fundamental components the way that government impacts job creation, and that's litigation, regulation, and taxation. And right now, we have all three of those messed up, and we have got to make some substantial changes to get back to a fair and level playing field from litigation and get to a point where we have reasonable regulation. And then we've got to begin to move in the direction of optimizing taxation, maximizing the individual's ability to invest in their company, grow their company, create jobs, which, as we all know, ultimately drives the economy.
Do you think, as I was reading through the changes, some of the changes in the bill seem to be rather subtle, some semantics about whether or not discrimination can be whether it's actionable if it's a contributing factor as opposed to a motivating factor. Is there a groundswell from the business community to make these types of changes? Or sometimes, as a practicing lawyer, I've noticed that there's one case where it's a unique set of circumstances. It's kind of fact-driven, and you get a case out of the Court of Appeals, and the headlines make it seem like it's just this travesty of justice. When in effect, it's very fact-specific. It doesn't have broad application. Have there been lots of cases? Has there been a hue or cry, or is this? Do you think this is a little more symbolic, where we want to? There isn't really something to fix as much as we want to be perceived by the national and international business community that were business friendly. What do you think's really going on?
Well, I think two things have happened. One is when those rulings came down, the business community and the legal community that defends the business community was very concerned. But as we know, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to really understand the impact of those decisions. What occurred was as time has gone on, meaning the last few years, and we've seen what have happened, because Missouri always mirrored the federal government, and we didn't actually have state statute actually on our books, that case law became the practice law. And so what happened, although I don't believe it was intentional, the reality is these court cases became the precedent for the public policy that is now being followed in our state. And I believe that the legislature, in that process of getting it through the House and the Senate and getting a governor to sign it, that is what should determine the public policy of our state, not one or two court cases. And so, for me, it's twofold. It's one, that unfortunately these cases have taken and moved our state into this environment, whether we like it or not, that it's perceived as unfriendly to business. And then the second component of that is ultimately when we're going to be talking about the public policy of a state and how are we going to, for lack of a better term, how are our courts going to interpret and judge when those disputes come up, I believe that public policy should be decided in the legislative branch, not the judicial branch.
Do you think it has legs this year? You've tried it before.
We passed it last year, both in the House and Senate. Governor vetoed it. Both the House and the Senate have passed versions out this year. They're different. We're going to have to figure out where we want to get to on that. We're trying to have dialogue with the governor to find out, what components could he live with? Are there components that he just adamantly cannot take? And try to work through that, for lack of a better term, that public policy process to get something on his desk that he can sign. So although it's early in session, I will tell you that, every year that we come back, this becomes more and more important. And the reality is at some point you have to address this problem. Otherwise, we're just going to keep coming back every year with this challenge still hanging out there.
Senator, thanks for that background. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about another pretty important topic on the state budget. Thanks for joining us, and come right back in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. 2 o'clock. Okay.
Your employees who serve in the National Guard and Reserve may seem different. They may work a little harder, be more confident, more willing to make the extra effort to get the job done right. So when your employees need time off to serve, remember, it's not just good for our country, it's good for your business.
Glad you could all make it.
Explore new worlds. Read. Visit literacy.gov and let the journey begin.
Welcome back to Capital City Matters. I'm John Landwehr, and my guest today is Senator Brad Lager from Northwest Missouri. Thanks again for spending a few minutes with us during a very busy time, Senator.
Thanks again for letting us join you.
The other topic I want to visit with you about was I think it's HJR 43, which is a proposed constitutional amendment that would cap spending. It seems odd that in these days when we really don't have a lot of extra money to spend, why are we concerned now about a constitutional amendment to cap spending?
Two things. One, you have to take the first step and just kind of look back over the last decade to see what has happened as our economy has come up and down. And as you know, in the early 2000s, 03, 04, we had some pretty tough budget years. 05 was very difficult. We made a lot of reductions and brought our spending back in line with our revenues. What happened thereafter was 2006, 2007, we had tremendous growth. I mean, 1 year, 7.5% and 8%. So literally over a 2-year period, we had 15, 16% revenue growth. And guess what happened? The General Assembly spent every dime of it. So at the end of the day, what you have to make the decision of is, as we start talking about how do you grow your economy going forward, how do you create a state that has an economic climate with the greatest level of prosperity? Well, in order to do that, I believe this. I believe the best decisions on how to spend the money available in our state, I actually believe those decisions are best made by the families of our state, the taxpayers of our state, the citizens of our state. So for me, it's about how do you limit the growth of government so that individuals get to keep as much of their money as possible. Now, we all know that government has certain responsibilities that it has to do. But at the end of the day, and it's always done with good intentions, the reality is that every year, the General Assembly creates some new program that needs new funding, and ultimately you get to the point where the beast continues to consume more each year. And unfortunately, historically, it hasn't mattered if it's a Republican or Democrat. So the theory behind this is we know that there's going to be certain growth that happens in government, and that's whether it's inflationary growth, whether it's, we need to build roads, we need to fund schools, all the responsibilities that we have within our state government. But ultimately, what you also have to protect against is exactly what we watched happen at the federal level. And that is this explosion of spending where government continues to be a greater and greater percentage of your overall economy. Because there's a point where that's not healthy. We've seen it at the federal level. We as a state are pretty fortunate right now. Even though we have not done perfect in the past, we've done better than most states. And we're one of a handful of states that still have a AAA bond rating. We make the tough decisions to bring our budget into balance. But at the end of the day, you can have a revenue cap, you can have all these other ideas to how to stop government from spending. Without a hard spending cap, government will always continue to spend. They'll just figure out a creative way to do it.
But you mentioned, we all look at the federal government, and most of us would agree that some controls need to be imposed there. But we have a balanced budget amendment. I mean, is it a little bit paternalistic to say that here in 2012 that we don't trust our future elected officials enough, so that we're hunkering down now, but what implicit in this is that somehow the citizens don't trust elected officials enough so that to effectively manage budgets in the future, especially when we have things in place like the balanced budget amendment and the Hancock Amendment, for example.
Well, and those are both valid points. The Hancock Amendment, as you know, there's a limit in there, and that grows based from it was based on when the Hancock Amendment was passed, and then there's been an inflationary growth every year. Well, it is so far beyond where our revenue is today. We'll never hit that cap again. So Hancock, for all practical purposes, no longer exists. As for the balanced budget amendment, we do have it. But what happens is and I'll use the late 90s. In the late 90s, we had unprecedented prosperity. All types of economic growth, which led to government growth. Now, what happened was they kept hitting their spending limit. So instead of sending that money back to the taxpayers, which I actually believe they should have done, what they started doing was they started creating tax credits and other off-the-book spending.
Right.
So what ended up happening was they kept spending, but just in a way that doesn't go through the appropriations process, that hits the ledger in a different way. So the reality is that you are right. We have a balanced budget amendment, but the reality is that we have some very smart people in that Capitol building that figure out ways around those rules and those regulations. And until you say, listen, we're going to cap the way that you appropriate money, or cap your ability to growth, to inflationary growth plus population growth. I mean, adding in some reasonable factors, that is going to be the only way that you get your hands around the ultimate growth. I mean, I would humbly submit that as the federal government first started to, for lack of a better term, let's say, grow faster than it should have, everyone thought, oh, that'll just happen for a year or two and then we'll get it back into balance. But what happened is over decades, they couldn't get it back in. And now they're to the point where it's crushing us from an economic perspective. And we just want to make sure that we don't have that same problem at the state level.
Do we kind of have the opposite problem? For example, you know, state capital, we have a lot of state employees. Raises for state employees have been few and far between in the last decade.
That's right.
I heard our own Representative Jay Barnes is working on a salary commission, and he continues to remind us that I think Missouri may be 50th in the nation. I don't know if we're 45th or 50th, but you know, we've gone through a period of time now where, because of the balanced budget amendment and because we're a conservative state, our personnel and our services have been restrained to, I would argue, bare bones right now. I can't see state government getting a lot smaller without cutting into essential resources or essential services. As we hopefully, knock on wood, come out of recessionary times, and what my concern would be, and what I've heard some people say, is this really would put the lid on the opportunity to maybe recoup some of the lost opportunities to bring people up in terms of salaries, to backfill some of the programs that in the last, say, 5 years have just had to be slashed. Does this amendment allow, you know, if we get back to a 4 or 5% growth in Missouri, why shouldn't we be able to backfill some of the things that we've had to cut in the last 5 years? Because
Ultimately, two things. Number one, the first thing I would humbly submit is the structure by which our government operates under today is a structure that was put in place in the mid-'70s. So, you know, almost 40 years ago. And so the reality is that no company in this country operates under that structure. And the thing that I say we, meaning I think all levels of government have failed to do, and is that we have failed in the opportunity to utilize technology to make ourselves more efficient and more effective. You know, so maybe we can't have as many employees as we have today because we can use technology to downsize, but the ones that we have, we can pay them better. And they can actually make a living and you know, some of the things that we've talked about. Now, as that evolution starts to occur, the other component that we have to have some very difficult discussions around is what is the responsibility of state government? What is our actual role, and what can we afford to fund? Because the reality is we have spread ourselves so thin now, and we are involved in so many things now. The fundamental responsibilities of building roads, funding schools, ensuring that our most vulnerable are protected, ensuring that we have public safety. We have all of those services and all of those responsibilities cut to the bare minimum, but yet we have entitlement growth that is now outpacing general revenue. The reality is we have to have a restructure, and the only way that you change the dynamic in the direction by which we're going is you have to change the status quo. And unfortunately, the status quo is always the easiest to maintain. So part of what putting a spending cap in place does is it forces the legislature and it forces every decision maker within state government to understand the way they do it today cannot work going forward. The status quo is unacceptable, and the reality is we've got to make those changes.
Are there some relief valves? You know, I'm not
Sure.
a big fan of imposing. I think constitutional amendments in Missouri are a little bit. We have too many of them, and every
We
time
have a lot on the ballot.
You know, somebody wakes up with an idea, and instead of going through the legislative process,
Right.
they spend a couple $1 million and they get it passed. You know, and
They put it on the ballot.
You can argue whether that's good politics or not, but the problem with using the Constitution in Missouri for really not the way the U.S. Constitution is designed, but really as almost a super legislative act with all of these amendments, you know, every year, by placing that type of cap in the Constitution and creating those restraints that I understand could be beneficial. But are there relief valves?
There are.
In other words, are there with a 2/3 vote or some type of, is there a way for future legislators who are not irresponsible, but who have a different set of circumstances than you might have envisioned, is there a way for them to legislate, or have we restrained them to the extent that all they're doing is figuring out where to put their 10 marbles and then they go home?
No, it's actually there are two different relief valves. The first one being if revenues come in greater than what that growth, that acceptable growth rate is, the first thing that happens is they're put into a rainy day fund or a savings account, basically. And the theory behind it is so that we don't get ourselves into a situation like we have now. I mean, 2011 was a tough year. It was a tough year for natural disasters, whether it was the floods in southeast Missouri, the tornadoes in St. Louis through mid-Missouri down into Joplin, the devastation we have down there, the floods in northwest Missouri. And the reality is we have a tremendous amount of money being spent by the federal government right now in our state to help clean up, to help recover, to help rebuild. But ultimately, the state has the state has a 25% responsibility to help pay for some of that. So part of this sets that money aside so that you have it for those unfortunate natural disasters when it happens. But the other piece of this is there is a component to your point, which is if the citizens of our state choose to impose a new tax or an initiative goes to the voters to increase revenues through whatever that mechanism is, that the voters can say, yeah, we want to do this. And then that actually allows that lid or that cap to be adjusted upward.
Well, it's a struggle. It's no fun being over in that big white building, but I truly respect, because I've kind of watched it just from a municipal level.
Sure.
Of things that go on and being here in Jefferson City. There's a lot of hard work, a lot of detail, and it's not a fun time because the struggles, the fiscal struggles are very great, and we appreciate people to step forward, be leaders, be responsible, be statesmen. When you disagree with someone, I think I've watched you do it in a statesman-like way, and I think that bodes well for the future.
You know, I believe that in times of great challenge come great responsibility because of the great opportunities that are there. And so thank you for letting me be with you today.
Senator, thanks for coming over, and viewers at home, thanks for joining us for a few minutes with Capital City Matters, and we'll have another interesting topic of statewide significance next month. Take care.